Do you remember those dishes that once filled kitchens with rich aromas and family laughter, but now live only in memory? Recipes born from survival and love, passed down through generations, that somehow slipped off our tables. From pig ear sandwiches to sugar water pie, these meals told stories of resilience and resourcefulness. How did we let 30 foods so tied to culture and history nearly disappear? Hog maw, pig's stomach stew. At first glance, hog maw doesn't exactly scream comfort food. Pig's stomach? Really? But for generations of African American families, especially in the rural South, this humble dish was a symbol of survival, resourcefulness, and even celebration. Born out of a culture where no part of the hog could be wasted, hog maw was one of those dishes that carried people through lean times while still offering a taste of home. The preparation was straightforward, though not for the squeamish. The stomach had to be scrubbed, boiled, and cleaned, often an all-day affair before the real cooking even began. Once ready, it was stuffed with a mixture of potatoes, onions, and sausage, or leftover scraps of pork, then simmered low and slow until tender. The smell would fill the kitchen, thick and earthy, with the kind of aroma that warned neighbors something serious was happening on the stove. Seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever herbs were on hand, hog maw became more than the sum of its parts. A rich, hearty stew that stretched to feed a large family with only a few cheap ingredients. For many, this dish is remembered as a holiday or New Year's meal, tied to the same luck and prosperity traditions as black-eyed peas and collard greens. It was a way of turning what the world dismissed as scraps into a centerpiece worthy of gathering around the table. There's pride in that kind of alchemy. Today, hog maw has slipped into obscurity. You won't find it on a Grubhub menu or in glossy cookbooks. But its story lingers in family lore, the kind of dish whispered about with a mix of nostalgia and side-eye. In a world obsessed with nose-to-tail dining, hog maw deserves recognition as the original, unapologetic pioneer of the practice. Chitlins, chitterlings. Few foods divide people quite like chitlins. For some, the very mention of pig intestines sparks memories of holidays, family reunions, and kitchens filled with laughter. For others, it conjures up the unmistakable smell that lingers long after the pot has been scrubbed. Yet chitlins or chitterlings hold a special place in African American culinary history, born from necessity and transformed into tradition. During slavery, when the choice cuts of pork went to the enslavers, the discarded parts, feet, ears, intestines, were left to the enslaved. What could have been seen as an insult became instead a canvas for creativity. Chitlins required patience and grit, hours of cleaning, soaking, and scrubbing to remove every trace of waste. Only then could they be boiled for hours with onions, vinegar, hot peppers, or whatever spices were available. The result was tender strands of meat with a flavor as earthy as the history they carried. Eating chitlins was never just about the taste. It was about endurance, making something nourishing from what others deemed worthless. Over time, they became a celebratory dish, appearing on holiday tables, especially around Christmas and New Year's. The labor of love required to prepare them turned the meal into an event, one that often pulled the whole family into the kitchen. Today, chitlins are far less common. Many younger generations shy away from the intense smell or the painstaking preparation. But to dismiss them outright is to overlook a food that embodies resilience. In a culinary world where nose-to-tail dining is trendy and chefs boast about using every part of the animal, chitlins stand as a reminder. African American cooks mastered that philosophy centuries ago. Love them or hate them, chitlins tell a story that deserves to be remembered at the table. Hoppin' John, rice and black-eyed peas, original form. Hoppin' John is one of those dishes that hides its history in plain sight. At first glance, it looks simple. Rice, black-eyed peas, and a little pork for seasoning. But beneath that humble bowl lies centuries of tradition, resilience, and cultural exchange. Brought to the American South through the knowledge of enslaved Africans, many of whom carried rice-growing expertise from West Africa, Hoppin' John became a cornerstone of African-American foodways, proof that a dish could be both sustaining and symbolic. The original version was as straightforward as it was filling. Black-eyed peas were stewed until tender, often with a ham hock, bacon, or bits of salt pork if available. Rice, the essential backbone, was cooked separately until fluffy, then combined with the peas to create a dish that stretched meager ingredients into a meal for many. Seasonings were modest: onions, peppers, maybe a little vinegar, but the result was deeply comforting, the kind of food that nourished both body and spirit after long days of labor. Tradition tied Hoppin' John firmly to New Year's Day, when eating it was said to bring luck and prosperity for the year ahead. Black-eyed peas symbolized coins, rice represented abundance, and collard greens, often served alongside, promised paper money. It was more than folklore, it was a hopeful ritual for families who had endured hardship and were praying for better days. Over time, the dish has evolved, with chefs adding spices, fresh herbs, or even reinventing it as upscale Southern cuisine. But the original Hoppin' John remains a testament to ingenuity born from scarcity. In an age of fast food and meal kits, its enduring message still resonates: that with patience, community, and a handful of humble ingredients, you can cook up not just a meal, but a little bit of hope. Ash cakes. Ash cakes sound almost mythical now, like something a pioneer grandmother might have whispered about. But for African Americans during slavery and the Reconstruction era, they were the ultimate survival food. Imagine a time when flour was scarce, ovens were non-existent, and a fire pit was the only reliable tool. Out of that reality came ash cakes, simple cornmeal patties baked directly in the ashes of a wood fire. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. The preparation was as straightforward as it gets. Cornmeal, water, and maybe a pinch of salt if there was any to spare, mixed into a rough dough and patted into small rounds. Those rounds were tucked into the hot ashes at the edge of the fire, covered lightly, and left to bake until firm. When pulled from the embers, the cakes would be brushed off and eaten plain or with whatever scraps of molasses, fatback, or greens were available. They were smoky, hearty, and above all, filling. This wasn't about culinary flair. It was about survival on the barest of means. But ash cakes weren't just food. They were resilience embodied. They could be made anywhere there was a fire, which meant they traveled easily with field workers, freedom seekers on the road north, or families who simply didn't have access to a kitchen. A pile of cornmeal and a flame could turn into sustenance, a small act of defiance against hunger. Today, the idea of deliberately burying food in ashes might raise eyebrows, but ironically, modern foodies line up for wood-fired pizzas and artisan hearth breads that owe something to this same tradition. Ash cakes may not appear on TikTok cooking hacks anytime soon, but they remind us that some of the most powerful foods in history were born not of abundance, but of ingenuity. Watermelon rind pickles. If you grew up thinking watermelon was just about the sweet, juicy red flesh, then you missed the thrifty brilliance of watermelon rind pickles. Once upon a time, no part of the fruit went to waste. not even the pale, flavorless rind that most of us toss without a second thought. For African American families, especially in the rural South, pickling watermelon rinds was a way to stretch summer's bounty and ensure a little brightness carried over into the colder months. It was both frugality and creativity in a mason jar. The process began after the sweet flesh was eaten down to the rind. The green outer skin would be carefully peeled away, leaving the crisp white layer beneath. This was cut into cubes or strips and then soaked in a brine of vinegar, sugar, and spices, often cloves, cinnamon, and allspice. Sometimes ginger or lemon peel made an appearance too, adding warmth and tang. After a long simmer and a rest in the jar, the bland rind transformed into something entirely new, sweet, tart, spicy, and refreshing all at once. These pickles weren't just condiments, they were a bridge between meals, often served alongside fried chicken, biscuits, or collard greens. Their sharp sweetness cut through heavy, salty foods and balanced plates built on humble staples. For many, opening a jar of watermelon rind pickles was like unlocking a piece of summer in the dead of winter. A reminder that joy could be preserved even in lean times. Today, watermelon rind pickles have largely slipped from everyday tables, though they occasionally resurface in hip farm-to-table restaurants as a rediscovered Southern delicacy. But for those who remember them from church suppers or grandmother's pantry, they're more than a novelty. They're a taste of history, proof that nothing, not even a rind, had to go to waste. Neckbone soup. Neckbone soup may not carry the prestige of oxtail stew or the Instagram-ready appeal of bone broth, but for generations of African American families, it was a quiet cornerstone of the kitchen. Born from thrift and necessity, this dish transformed the parts of the hog or cow that butchers often considered scraps into something rich, hearty, and deeply satisfying. The beauty of neck bones lay in their very limitations. A little meat clinging to bone, a lot of flavor hiding in marrow, and the slow patience it took to coax it all into a meal. The process started with cleaning and boiling the neck bones, often pork, until the broth grew cloudy and fragrant. Onions, garlic, celery, and carrots might be added if available, though in leaner times, a pot of beans, cabbage, or potatoes would do just as well. As the neck bones simmered for hours, their modest scraps of meat loosened and fell into the broth, creating a soup that was both filling and nourishing. It wasn't about excess, it was about extracting every ounce of goodness from what you had. For many, neckbone soup carried the taste of home. It was the dish you ate on a Sunday afternoon, ladled into bowls with cornbread on the side, the kind of food that filled a crowded kitchen with warmth. The slow-simmered aroma became a sensory shorthand for family, resilience, and the art of making do. Today, neckbone soup doesn't appear on trendy menus or in glossy cookbooks, yet its spirit lives on. In a food culture obsessed with sustainable eating and zero-waste cooking, this humble dish feels ahead of its time. Long before hashtags and culinary movements, African American cooks were already practicing nose-to-tail eating, turning overlooked cuts into soul-sustaining meals. Neckbone soup was, and remains, proof that nothing was ever truly wasted. Red gravy. In African American kitchens, especially in the Creole and Southern traditions, red gravy was far more than just a sauce. It was a simmering pot of sustenance, a way to stretch a few ingredients into something that could drape over rice, bread, or pasta and suddenly feel like a feast. Red gravy was tomato-based, often starting with nothing more than canned or fresh tomatoes, onions, bell peppers, and a little fat, usually bacon grease or lard saved from the morning's cooking. From there, it could be built up with sausage, chicken, or even leftover scraps of pork, whatever the household could spare. The preparation was slow and deliberate, a kind of culinary patience that allowed flavors to meld over a low flame. Spices were modest: garlic, bay leaves, maybe a pinch of cayenne, but the result was deeply layered. Ladled over a plate of rice, it turned a cheap starch into a hearty meal that could feed a family. Red gravy wasn't fancy, but that was precisely the point. It was economical cooking at its finest, born of necessity and flavored with memory. For many families, red gravy was a Sunday dish, filling the house with its rich aroma while conversations and laughter unfolded around the kitchen table. It was comfort food in the truest sense, a reminder that nourishment wasn't only about calories. It was about care, tradition, and the joy of making something out of very little. Today, red gravy has slipped quietly into the background, overshadowed by marinara jars on grocery shelves and quick-fix sauces that promise homemade taste. But to those who grew up with it, nothing in a jar compares. Red gravy was never just about taste, it was about presence, patience, and the artistry of turning survival into flavor. It remains one of those quietly powerful dishes that deserves remembering. Souse, pickled pig's feet, head cheese. Souse is one of those dishes that instantly separates the adventurous eaters from the faint of heart. To some, the words pickled pig's feet or head cheese sound like a dare rather than dinner. But in African American kitchens of the past, souse was nothing short of resourcefulness made edible, a dish that honored the principle of using every part of the animal. Born from frugality and necessity, it turned odds and ends into something tangy, savory, and surprisingly refreshing. The process began with the parts nobody else wanted: pig's feet, hog's head, sometimes even ears. These cuts were scrubbed and boiled for hours until the meat and cartilage softened and the gelatin-rich broth thickened. The tender bits were then chopped up, mixed back into the broth, and seasoned with vinegar, onions, peppers, and spices. Once poured into a dish and chilled, it set into a jellied loaf that could be sliced and served cold, often with crackers or bread. The flavor was sharp, vinegary, and bracing, perfect for cutting through heavy, greasy foods. But beyond taste, souse carried meaning. It was communal food, often appearing at gatherings, church picnics, or holiday tables, where someone's uncle or grandmother would proudly offer a plate. It was proof that ingenuity could transform scraps into delicacies, that flavor could be coaxed from parts most people ignored. Eating it wasn't just about nourishment. It was about connection to heritage and the stubborn resilience of turning little into plenty. Today, souse has largely vanished from mainstream tables, though it lingers in pockets of the South and Caribbean where the tradition still thrives. In an age when charcuterie boards are trendy and chefs celebrate nose-to-tail cuisine, souse deserves recognition as an original, unpretentious form of that same ethos. For those who remember, it's more than food, it's history in a slice. Molasses bread. Molasses bread was once the quiet star of the kitchen table, a humble loaf that carried with it the sweetness of survival and the warmth of community. Long before white sugar became widely affordable, molasses was the sweetener of choice in many African American households, particularly in the South. Thick, dark, and slightly bitter, it was cheaper and more accessible than refined sugar. And when stirred into bread dough, it gave life to a loaf that could feed a family and linger in memory. The preparation was simple but deliberate. Flour, yeast, water, and salt formed the base, and into that went generous spoonfuls of molasses, lending both sweetness and a deep, earthy richness. Some recipes added cornmeal for texture or buttermilk for tenderness, depending on what was on hand. The dough would be kneaded, left to rise, and then baked until the kitchen filled with the scent of caramel and warmth. The result was a dense but soft bread, hearty enough to stand alone yet versatile enough to pair with soups, stews, or simply a pat of butter. Molasses bread carried emotional weight as well. It was often baked in big loaves to be shared, sliced thick for children coming in from chores or for guests who dropped by unannounced. Its flavor was unmistakable, sweet but not cloying, with a rustic tang that spoke of thrift and tradition. In many homes, it wasn't just food, it was comfort on a plate. Today, molasses bread has been pushed aside by the convenience of supermarket loaves and the allure of artisanal sourdoughs. Yet, its story resonates. In a world rediscovering heritage baking and whole flavors, molasses bread stands as a reminder that African American kitchens were crafting soulful, resourceful loaves long before food trends tried to catch up. It was nourishment, memory, and resilience baked into every slice. Fatback biscuits. Fatback biscuits were never meant to be fancy, but they carried the kind of flavor and sustenance that made them unforgettable. In the days when butter was a luxury and lard had to stretch across a week's worth of meals, fatback, the salted, cured slab of pork taken from a pig's back, was the unsung hero of the kitchen. Salty, rich, and always on hand, it became the backbone of many dishes, but perhaps none more beloved than the humble biscuit. The process was frugal ingenuity at its best. Strips of fatback were rendered slowly, releasing their oil, which was then folded into flour, salt, and just enough water or buttermilk to form a dough. Sometimes the crispy bits of fried fatback themselves were chopped and pressed directly into the biscuits, turning them into savory little pockets of flavor. Once baked in a hot oven or even in a cast iron skillet over a fire, the biscuits emerged golden and flaky, their edges tinged with salt and smoke. They were simple, but they were filling. A portable meal for laborers in the fields or children heading out for a long day. Fatback biscuits also carried a sense of community. They were often made in large batches for Sunday gatherings or shared among neighbors who stopped by unannounced. Paired with molasses, syrup, or simply eaten plain, they represented both hospitality and resourcefulness. Proof that even the humblest ingredient could create something worth savoring. Today, fatback biscuits have nearly disappeared from everyday kitchens. Modern palates may prefer butter-rich versions, while health trends shy away from their salty indulgence. Yet for those who grew up with them, a bite of fatback biscuit is more than taste. It's memory. It's the story of families who turned scraps into sustenance and sustenance into love. Hoe cakes. Hoe cakes may sound like something dreamed up by a modern brunch menu, but their roots run deep in African American history, born from necessity, simplicity, and sheer ingenuity. Long before cast iron skillets sat on every stovetop, enslaved people and poor farmers made use of what they had: open fires, cornmeal, and iron hoes used in the fields. Flat rounds of cornmeal batter were spread onto the back of a clean hoe blade and set near hot coals, cooking into crisp-edged cakes that could be eaten plain or with whatever scraps of fat, syrup, or greens were available. Out of this improvisation came a dish that was filling, portable, and remarkably versatile. The batter itself was as bare bones as survival required: cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt. Maybe a splash of buttermilk if fortune allowed. Poured thin, the cakes cooked quickly, developing a crusty exterior while staying tender inside. Eaten hot off the hoe or later in the fields, hoe cakes were a reminder that nourishment didn't have to be elaborate. It just had to keep you going. They were often served alongside soups or beans or simply crumbled into pot liquor, the rich broth left behind after cooking greens. Hoe cakes carried more than flavor. They carried identity. They were a taste of West African foodways reborn in the American South, proof of continuity despite displacement. Families passed down recipes, some sweetened with molasses, others fried in leftover bacon grease, each variation tied to memory and resourcefulness. Today, hoe cakes surface occasionally on Southern menus or as a novelty at food festivals, often described as cornmeal pancakes. But their story is deeper than culinary trendiness. They are a symbol of survival cooking, of turning the humblest ingredients into sustenance. A hoe cake isn't just bread. It's history crisped golden on the fire. Sugar water pie. Sugar water pie is the kind of dessert that sounds almost like a joke until you taste it. Born out of the Great Depression and carried on in lean times, it was the ultimate example of making something from practically nothing. When eggs, butter, or cream were scarce and money was tighter than tight, families still craved something sweet at the end of a hard day. And so, out of ingenuity and a bit of desperation came this humble pie made from sugar, water, flour, and a dash of vanilla if you were lucky. The preparation was as plain as its name. A simple pie crust, sometimes homemade, sometimes whatever scraps of dough were left from another dish, was filled with a mixture of sugar dissolved in water, thickened slightly with flour, and baked until it set into a translucent, custard-like filling. No eggs, no milk, just pantry staples stretched to their absolute limit. The result wasn't fancy, but it was sweet, silky, and comforting. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, dessert still had a place at the table. For many African American families, sugar water pie was more than a sweet treat. It was a symbol of resilience, proof that joy and indulgence didn't always require abundance. Children especially remembered it with fondness, savoring each slice as if it were a treasure. It carried the warmth of togetherness, of parents and grandparents refusing to let hardship erase moments of sweetness. Today, sugar water pie has nearly vanished, overshadowed by cheesecakes and glossy desserts that rely on dozens of ingredients. But in an era when minimalist recipes and three-ingredient hacks trend online, this Depression-era dessert feels oddly ahead of its time. Sugar water pie is a lesson in thrift, a sweet testimony that even when the cupboard was nearly bare, hope could still be baked into a crust. Cabbage stew with salt pork. Cabbage stew with salt pork was never meant to dazzle anyone with sophistication, but it was the kind of dish that kept families fed, warm, and together through long winters and lean times. In African American kitchens, particularly during the Depression and well into the mid-20th century, it was a staple of survival cooking. Cabbage was cheap, filling, and easy to grow, while salt pork, fatty, heavily salted, and shelf-stable, was often the only meat a family could afford. Combined in a pot with water and whatever vegetables were on hand, these two humble ingredients transformed into a meal that was hearty, salty, and deeply comforting. The method was as simple as it was effective. A chunk of salt pork was rinsed to reduce its brine and then simmered in a pot of water, releasing its fat and flavor. Into that base went chopped cabbage, onions, carrots, or potatoes if the household had them. The stew would bubble slowly on the stove, the cabbage softening and soaking up the smoky, savory notes of the pork. Sometimes cornbread or biscuits were served alongside to mop up the broth, stretching the meal even further. This wasn't fine dining, it was practical cooking designed to fill stomachs and stretch pennies. But the stew carried more than nutrition. It carried the feeling of home, of mothers and grandmothers turning scarcity into comfort, of a warm kitchen on a cold night. For children who grew up on it, the smell of cabbage and salt pork simmering is a memory that clings, tied to family tables and laughter that rose even when times were hard. Today, cabbage stew has largely disappeared from modern menus, replaced by glossy soups and artisanal stews. Yet in its simplicity lies a story of resilience. Proof that with a little pork and a head of cabbage, families could nourish both body and spirit. Parched corn snack. Parched corn snack is one of those old-time foods that has almost completely slipped through the cracks of memory, yet for centuries it was a reliable companion for African Americans, Native peoples, and pioneers alike. Long before convenience stores sold chips and candy bars, parched corn was the original pocket snack, lightweight, portable, and full of energy. For enslaved Africans working long hours in the fields, or for families traveling during the Great Migration, a handful of parched corn could mean the difference between hunger and endurance. The method was deceptively simple. Dried kernels of corn were slowly roasted in a skillet or pan, often without oil, until they puffed slightly and developed a toasty, nutty flavor. Sometimes a sprinkle of salt was added, or a touch of sugar if the household had any to spare, but most often it was eaten plain. Crunchy, chewy, and satisfying, parched corn was easy to carry in a pocket or pouch, lasting for days without spoiling. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical fuel for people who had no luxury of refrigeration or packaged snacks. Parched corn also carried cultural weight. In African American communities, it was often prepared in bulk and shared, a communal food that tied people together through necessity and tradition. It linked back to African foodways where roasted grains were common and echoed Native American practices that made similar use of maize. In that sense, it was not just a snack, but a living thread of cultural continuity across continents and generations. Today, parched corn is almost unheard of outside of survivalist circles or occasional heritage festivals. Yet, its spirit lives on in every granola bar or trail mix marketed as on-the-go energy. Parched corn was there first, proof that the simplest foods often carry the deepest history. It was thrift, resilience, and ingenuity popped into your pocket. Bread pudding. Bread pudding may be served today in upscale restaurants with caramel drizzle or bourbon sauce, but its roots are far humbler and far more poignant. For African American families, especially during the Depression and mid-20th century, bread pudding was the embodiment of waste not, want not. When fresh loaves went stale and every penny had to be stretched, resourceful cooks refused to let a single crumb go to waste. Instead, they transformed yesterday's bread into a warm, sweet, custardy dish that comforted both belly and soul. The preparation was both simple and ingenious. Stale bread was torn into chunks and soaked in a mixture of milk or condensed milk, sugar, and eggs when they were available. Spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, or vanilla were added if the pantry allowed, and sometimes raisins or scraps of fruit found their way into the mix. Once baked, the pudding emerged golden and bubbling, with crispy edges surrounding a soft, custard-like center. Each bite carried both sweetness and the subtle tang of thrift, proving that frugality could also taste like indulgence. Bread pudding was more than just dessert. It was memory-made edible. It often appeared on Sunday tables, at church suppers, or during holidays when families pooled together what little they had to make something special. Children grew up associating its rich aroma with warmth, togetherness, and the quiet pride of parents who could conjure joy out of scarcity. Today, bread pudding has taken on new life in the culinary world, reinvented with chocolate, bourbon, or artisanal breads. Yet the heart of it remains unchanged, a dish born from resourcefulness carried by tradition and loved for its ability to comfort. For those who grew up with it, bread pudding will always taste less like extravagance and more like home. Pot liquor soup. Pot liquor soup is one of those dishes that proves flavor doesn't always come from the star ingredient, but from what's left behind. In African American kitchens, particularly in the rural South, pot liquor was the broth left after cooking down a pot of greens, collards, turnips, or mustard, slow simmered with a ham hock, salt pork, or bits of smoked meat. That liquor from the pot, as the name suggests, was far too rich and too precious to pour away. Instead, it was transformed into its own dish, stretched with cornbread, beans, or vegetables to become a bowl of sustenance that carried both flavor and memory. The base of pot liquor was deeply seasoned, smoky from the pork and earthy from the greens. Families would ladle the broth into bowls and crumble cornbread directly into it, soaking up every drop. Sometimes potatoes or onions were added for heft. Sometimes nothing more than the broth itself was served, warm and bracing. In lean households, pot liquor was often more nourishing than the greens themselves, carrying vitamins and nutrients that would have otherwise gone to waste. It was resourcefulness at its purest, making sure every ounce of goodness was used. But pot liquor was more than nutrition. It was cultural glue. Grandmothers swore by it as a cure for colds, a comfort for the weary, or a memory of home. The ritual of crumbling cornbread into the broth was as much about connection as it was about taste. Pot liquor brought people together around the table, reminding them that simplicity could be as satisfying as abundance. Today, pot liquor rarely gets its due, overshadowed by flashier soups and stews. Yet, in an age where chefs champion broths and bone stock, pot liquor deserves recognition as an original. It is history simmered down, resilience in a bowl, and proof that what some might throw away can become the heart of a meal. Oxtail stew. Oxtail stew has long been a dish that transforms the overlooked into the unforgettable. Once considered scraps, oxtails were inexpensive and often given away or sold cheaply at butcher shops. For African American families, they became the foundation of a slow-cooked masterpiece, a dish that coaxed tenderness and richness from a cut of meat that many others ignored. With time, patience, and a heavy pot, oxtails simmered into something that could turn an ordinary day into a special occasion. The preparation was a ritual in itself. Oxtails, cleaned and seasoned, were browned in fat until their edges turned golden. Then came the vegetables: onions, carrots, celery, sometimes tomatoes, all layered in to build flavor. Water or broth was added, and the pot was left to do its work over low heat for hours, the tough meat breaking down into silky strands while the marrow from the bones enriched the broth. The result was a stew that was both hearty and elegant, with a depth of flavor that seemed impossible given its humble beginnings. Served over rice with cornbread or simply in a bowl, it was comfort at its finest. Beyond sustenance, oxtail stew carried cultural resonance. It was a dish that rewarded patience, often cooked on weekends or holidays when families had time to gather. The smell of it simmering became part of the household rhythm, a sensory marker of warmth and togetherness. For children, it was a treat, a reminder that sometimes the best meals weren't flashy but slow and deliberate. Ironically, the same cut once dismissed as scraps is now considered a delicacy, with prices that make it nearly a luxury item. Trendy restaurants tout oxtail stew as gourmet, but for those who grew up with it, the dish will always be more than a trend. It is memory, resilience, and love, simmered, bone deep. Stewed okra with tomatoes. Stewed okra with tomatoes is one of those dishes that perfectly captures the rhythm of Southern kitchens, where gardens and ingenuity shaped what ended up on the table. Okra itself, carried to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade, has always held a special place in African American foodways. Paired with tomatoes, whether fresh from the vine or canned during leaner seasons, it became a dish that was at once simple, nourishing, and deeply rooted in tradition. The preparation was uncomplicated, as most survival foods were meant to be. Fresh okra pods were sliced into rounds and combined with chopped tomatoes, onions, garlic, and a little fat, sometimes bacon drippings, sometimes a splash of vegetable oil. The mixture simmered gently until the okra softened, releasing its characteristic thickening quality, which turned the stew into something rich and cohesive. Seasoned with salt, pepper, and a dash of cayenne or hot sauce if available, the dish carried both tang and earthiness, its flavors melding into a balance that could stand alone or accompany rice, cornbread, or beans. For families, stewed okra with tomatoes was more than just a side dish. It was a taste of summer preserved in memory, a reminder of gardens tended with care, and the joy of stretching a handful of vegetables into a meal for many. Children might wrinkle their noses at the okra's texture, but the dish endured, handed down from one generation to the next, always tied to the flavors of home. Today, stewed okra with tomatoes doesn't often appear on restaurant menus, overshadowed by flashier Southern staples. Yet it remains a quiet classic, celebrated in the kitchens that keep heritage alive. In its simplicity lies its genius, a dish that speaks to resilience, seasonality, and the ability to turn the land's gifts into something soulful and sustaining. Field peas and snaps. Field peas and snaps may not sound glamorous, but for generations of African American families across the South, they were the very definition of comfort food. This simple pairing, field peas, a cousin to the black-eyed pea, and snaps, or tender green bean pods broken into pieces, was born from the garden and shaped by necessity. Both crops thrived in the southern climate, easy to grow, hardy in the soil, and endlessly versatile. When combined in a pot, they created a dish that was inexpensive, nourishing, and deeply satisfying. Cooking field peas and snaps was a slow, steady process. The peas, shelled and rinsed, went into a pot of water along with the snapped beans. To build flavor, a ham hock, strip of fat back, or piece of salt pork was often added, releasing a smoky richness as the vegetables simmered. Onions, garlic, or peppers might make their way in, depending on what was available, but the soul of the dish came from time and patience. The peas softened, the snaps held just enough bite, and the broth turned into a savory liquor that begged to be sopped up with cornbread. Beyond taste, the dish carried the weight of tradition. It was food from the land, often picked by the same hands that later cooked it. Families gathered around bowls of field peas and snaps in the height of summer when gardens overflowed, and in the leaner months, when dried peas could be pulled from the pantry. For many, it was a reminder of self-sufficiency, of communities feeding themselves with what they grew. Today, the dish has been pushed aside by fast food and modern convenience, but it lingers in the memories of those who grew up with it. Field peas and snaps weren't fancy, but they were soulful, proving that simplicity, when seasoned with care, can be a feast in its own right. Buttermilk pie. Buttermilk pie is the kind of dessert that sneaks up on you. At first glance, it looks plain, almost modest. A golden custard baked into a flaky crust with no flashy toppings or elaborate presentation. Yet one bite reveals why this pie once held a treasured place on African American tables across the South. Sweet, tangy, and luxuriously smooth, it was proof that even the simplest ingredients could create something extraordinary. The magic of buttermilk pie lay in its thrift. Buttermilk itself was a byproduct, the liquid left after churning cream into butter. Instead of wasting it, resourceful cooks turned it into a base for baking, lending moisture and a gentle tang to everything from biscuits to cakes. In pie form, it was whisked together with eggs, sugar, a little flour, and a dash of vanilla or lemon zest if the pantry allowed. The mixture was poured into an unbaked crust and slid into the oven, where it transformed into a custard-like filling, with a flavor both rich and refreshing. For many families, buttermilk pie was a holiday favorite, often appearing on Thanksgiving or Christmas tables, alongside sweet potato and pecan pies. But it wasn't just for special occasions, it was also the kind of pie a grandmother might bake on an ordinary Sunday, filling the house with its warm, buttery scent. Its simplicity made it accessible, and its taste made it unforgettable. Today, buttermilk pie doesn't get the attention it deserves. Overshadowed by fancier desserts, it hides in the background, sometimes rediscovered at small-town diners or revivalist bakeries. Yet its story resonates. A dessert that turned what could have been discarded into something worth celebrating. Buttermilk pie is a reminder that the best sweets don't always require abundance, just a little resourcefulness and a lot of heart. Pig ear sandwiches. Pig ear sandwiches are one of those dishes that sound shocking to modern ears. Yet they were once a beloved staple in African American communities, particularly in the South. Like many soul food classics, they were born out of necessity when no part of the hog went unused. Pig ears, often discarded by wealthier households, became a delicacy in kitchens that knew how to coax flavor and texture from the humblest cuts. What began as survival food evolved into a sandwich with as much cultural weight as taste. The preparation was both simple and patient. Pig ears were cleaned thoroughly, then boiled for hours until tender but still slightly chewy. Once ready, they were sometimes crisped on a griddle or simply piled as is onto a slice of white bread, often with mustard, hot sauce, or pickles to cut through the richness. The result was a sandwich that combined textures, soft bread, chewy ear, tangy condiments, in a way that was both filling and flavorful. It was food that didn't pretend to be fancy but made no apologies for being satisfying. Beyond flavor, the pig ear sandwich carried a sense of place and identity. In many towns, they were sold from small diners, street vendors, or community gatherings, becoming a cheap but hearty meal that stuck to the ribs. They were part of a broader tradition of nose-to-tail eating, a practice that's now praised as sustainable but was back then simply survival. For those who grew up with them, pig ear sandwiches weren't oddities. They were a taste of home and community. Today, they've mostly vanished from mainstream menus, surviving in a few regional spots or nostalgic kitchens. But their story remains powerful, a reminder of how resourcefulness turned scraps into tradition, and tradition into memory between two slices of bread. Turkey necks and rice. Turkey necks and rice may not sound glamorous, but for generations, they were a dependable comfort food, the kind of dish that stretched a dollar and filled a family. In African American kitchens, especially throughout the South, turkey necks were often overlooked cuts, inexpensive and abundant in local markets. Yet what they lacked in prestige, they more than made up for in flavor. With patience and care, these bony, meaty necks released a richness that transformed plain rice into a dish worthy of the Sunday table. The cooking process was all about time. Turkey necks were first cleaned and seasoned, then browned or dropped straight into a pot of simmering broth. Onions, garlic, bell peppers, and celery, the holy trinity of Southern cooking, were often added, creating a savory base that filled the kitchen with its aroma. The necks simmered slowly until their meat grew tender enough to slip off the bone, enriching the broth along the way. That liquid gold was then ladled over rice, soaking every grain with smoky, peppery depth. The dish was as frugal as it was satisfying, turning what many considered scraps into a centerpiece. For families, turkey necks and rice carried the weight of memory and tradition. It was the kind of meal that might greet children after school, or simmer on the stove during long afternoons when money was tight, but love was abundant. A plate of turkey necks and rice was more than just dinner. It was proof of resilience, a reminder that good food didn't depend on expensive ingredients. Today, the dish has faded from everyday kitchens, though it lingers in soul food spots and family gatherings where heritage still holds sway. In a world chasing culinary trends, turkey necks and rice remind us that comfort is often found in the overlooked, slow-cooked, and deeply seasoned ham hock collards. Ham hock collards are one of those dishes that carry history in every bite, a bowl where flavor and survival come together. For African American families across the South, collard greens simmered with smoked ham hock were more than just food. They were a tradition, a ritual, and a source of pride. Collards, sturdy and inexpensive, were a dependable crop, while ham hocks, the tough, fatty end of a pig's leg, were often one of the few cuts available to working-class households. Together, they became a dish that transformed thrift into abundance. The preparation was deceptively simple. A ham hock was set to simmer in a pot of water until its smoky, salty richness filled the broth. Into that liquid went bunches of collard greens, cleaned and cut into ribbons, along with onions, garlic, and maybe a pinch of red pepper flakes. Over hours of slow cooking, the greens softened, absorbing the flavor of the ham hock, while the meat itself grew tender enough to shred into the pot. The result was a dish that was savory, hearty, and comforting, with a pot liquor broth at the bottom so prized it was often sopped up with cornbread. But beyond nourishment, ham hock collards carried emotional weight. They were a Sunday staple, a New Year's Day necessity for luck and prosperity, and a dish tied to family gatherings where everyone had a seat at the table. The aroma of collards simmering was as much a marker of home as laughter in the kitchen or gospel music on the radio. Today, Ham hock collards still surface at holiday spreads, but are often replaced in everyday cooking with quicker, lighter versions. Yet the original holds a power that can't be duplicated. It is memory simmered, low and slow, a reminder that the best flavors often come from patience, resilience, and love. Cowpea salad. Cowpea salad is one of those dishes that rarely gets talked about today. Yet for generations, it was a familiar sight at family gatherings, picnics, and church suppers. The cowpea, a cousin to the black-eyed pea, has long roots in African and African-American food traditions. Hardy, drought-resistant, and easy to grow, it was a staple crop in the South and a reliable source of protein when meat was scarce. Turning those humble peas into a salad wasn't just practical. It was a way of creating something refreshing, colorful, and nourishing from the simplest of ingredients. The salad itself began with cooked cowpeas, tender but not mushy, cooled and tossed with whatever vegetables were on hand. Chopped onions, bell peppers, celery, and sometimes tomatoes gave it crunch and brightness. A dressing of vinegar, oil, sugar, and spices tied it all together. The tangy sweet marinade soaking into the beans overnight to deepen the flavor. Served chilled, cowpea salad was the kind of dish that stood proudly alongside fried chicken, ribs, or collards, balancing heavier foods with its lightness and zip. For many families, this salad was more than just a side dish. It was community food. It traveled well, making it a staple at outdoor gatherings and potlucks, where big bowls of it would be passed around, feeding crowds with ease. Its flavor spoke of the garden, of summer abundance, and of resourcefulness in stretching a small crop into a dish that could serve many. Today, cowpea salad has almost disappeared from the mainstream table, overshadowed by potato salad, coleslaw, and other picnic standbys. Yet its story is worth remembering. In its tangy simplicity lies a reminder of how African-American cooks took what the land gave them and turned it into sustenance, flavor, and tradition. Cowpea salad wasn't just food, it was heritage in a bowl. Salmon croquettes. Salmon croquettes are the kind of dish that instantly recalls the hum of a busy kitchen, the sound of patties sizzling in a skillet, and the smell of something savory wafting through the house. For African-American families, especially in the mid-20th century, croquettes were a weeknight staple, born out of thrift and creativity. They relied on canned salmon, a shelf-stable pantry item that was both affordable and filling, making it possible to put protein on the table even when money was scarce. The preparation was straightforward but full of care. Canned salmon, often with bones and skin included, was flaked into a bowl and mixed with eggs, breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, diced onion, and seasonings like salt, pepper, and sometimes a dash of hot sauce. Shaped into patties and fried in a hot skillet with a little oil, they developed a crisp golden crust that gave way to a tender, flavorful center. Served with rice, grits, or simply a slice of white bread, salmon croquettes turned a humble can of fish into a meal that felt complete. But the dish carried more than taste. It carried memory. For many, croquettes were tied to the rhythm of everyday life. A quick dinner before church, a lunch packed in a tin for work, or the food that greeted you after school. Grandmothers often had their own twist, whether it was adding chopped peppers for color or frying them in bacon grease for extra depth. Eating them wasn't just about filling a plate. It was about continuity, about passing down small traditions hidden in the folds of family life. Today, salmon croquettes are less common, overshadowed by trendier seafood dishes. but their legacy lingers. They remind us that with a can, a skillet, and some imagination, resourcefulness could always taste like love. Chow chow. Chow chow is one of those old-fashioned condiments that once had a place on nearly every Southern table, but today lives mostly in the memories of grandparents and the dusty shelves of specialty stores. Part relish, part pickled salad, it was the ultimate way to capture the last of the garden before frost set in. For African American families, chow chow wasn't just a side note to a meal. It was a burst of tang and spice that stretched humble dishes into something lively and memorable. The recipe varied from kitchen to kitchen, but the basics remained the same. End-of-season vegetables, green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, peppers, sometimes beans or cauliflower, were chopped and simmered in a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices. Mustard seed, celery seed, and turmeric often gave chow chow its bright kick, while the sweetness balanced the acidity. Once packed into jars, it could last through the winter, ready to be spooned over everything from pinto beans and collard greens to hot dogs and cornbread. Its sharp, pickled bite cut through rich or greasy foods, transforming everyday meals into something special. Chow chow also carried with it a sense of community and thrift. It was often made in large batches during canning season, with families gathering to chop vegetables and fill jars, knowing those efforts would sustain them through leaner months. For many children, the taste of chow chow was inseparable from the memory of watching elders work in the kitchen, laughter mingling with the smell of vinegar and spice. Today, chow chow has mostly slipped into obscurity, replaced by store-bought relishes, or simply forgotten. Yet its story is one of resilience and creativity, proof that African American cooks knew how to make the most of what the land gave them. Chow chow wasn't just relish, it was a tradition, bottled and preserved. Barbecued snoot, St. Louis specialty. Barbecued snoot is one of those dishes that makes people raise their eyebrows the first time they hear it. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. The snout of a pig, slow cooked and slathered in sauce until it becomes tender, smoky, and unexpectedly addictive. While it might seem unusual today, in mid-20th century St. Louis, barbecued snoot was a celebrated specialty, especially within African American communities that mastered the art of turning cast-off cuts into culinary treasures. The preparation was as much ritual as recipe. Snoots were cleaned and seasoned, then grilled or smoked low and slow until the tough skin crisped and the fat rendered into rich flavor. Once finished, they were chopped into pieces or served whole, drowned in a tangy, tomato-based barbecue sauce that balanced smokiness with sweetness. The texture was a mix of chewy, crunchy, and melt-in-your-mouth fatty, making it unlike any other barbecue cut. Piled onto white bread or served with beans and slaw, barbecued snoot was cheap, filling, and perfect for feeding a crowd. More than taste, barbecued snoot was about identity and ingenuity. In neighborhoods where resources were limited, pitmasters proved that no part of the hog was off limits when it came to creating something delicious. Snoot stands and backyard grills became community gathering spots where laughter and music mixed with the smell of smoke curling into the summer air. Eating snoot wasn't just about filling your stomach, it was about belonging to a culture that found pride in making much out of little. Today, barbecued snoot is hard to find, even in St. Louis, where only a handful of restaurants still serve it. As modern barbecue trends favor ribs and brisket, snoot lingers as a nearly forgotten relic. Yet for those who remember, it remains a symbol of resilience, creativity, and the joy of flavor born from resourcefulness. Hoghead cheese. Hoghead cheese is one of those dishes that defies its name. It's not cheese at all, but a savory terrine made from the boiled down parts of a hog's head, bound together in a gelatin-rich broth and chilled until sliceable. While today it might sound like the stuff of adventurous food shows, for African American families across the South, it was once a common delicacy, a way of ensuring that no part of the animal went to waste. Born out of thrift and necessity, hoghead cheese became a dish that balanced frugality with ingenuity. The process began with the labor of love that was cleaning and boiling a hog's head, sometimes including the jowls, ears, and tongue. Simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and spices, the meat softened, and the broth turned rich with collagen. Once cooled slightly, the tender scraps were chopped and mixed back into the broth, then poured into pans to set. Vinegar, hot peppers, or mustard seed might be added for brightness, depending on family tradition. When chilled, the mixture solidified into a loaf that could be sliced and eaten cold, often on crackers or bread, with a sharp, tangy kick that cut through its richness. Hoghead cheese was more than food. It was community. It often appeared at gatherings, holidays, or church events, where platters of thinly sliced portions were passed around as part of the spread. For many, the dish evoked memories of grandparents' kitchens, where the work of breaking down a hog was not wasteful but celebratory, a way of honoring the animal by using every part. Today, hoghead cheese lingers in small-town markets and specialty shops, though it has largely vanished from everyday tables. Still, its story remains one of resilience, creativity, and the ability to transform scraps into something worthy of pride and tradition. Devil's dust. Devil's dust is one of those kitchen secrets whispered more than written down, a seasoning mix that once held a quiet place in African American cooking. It wasn't a dish by itself, but a way to breathe fire and life into humble ingredients. Proof that even when the pantry was bare, flavor didn't have to be. In an era when spice racks weren't filled with rows of imported jars and convenient seasoning packets hadn't yet taken over, cooks made their own blends from whatever they had. Devil's dust was one of the most memorable, fiery, smoky, and versatile. The mix usually started with salt and black pepper, the two staples every kitchen kept close at hand. To that, cooks added cayenne or crushed red pepper for heat, sometimes paprika for smokiness, maybe a little garlic or onion powder if such luxuries were around. Every family had its version, often adjusted by taste or by what could be afforded at the corner store. Once blended, it was sprinkled onto everything from fried chicken and catfish to greens, beans, and cornbread. In some households, devil's dust was even shaken over popcorn or roasted peanuts, proof of its reach from everyday meals to small indulgences. Beyond its kick, devil's dust carried with it a kind of pride. It was a way of owning flavor, of not relying on store-bought seasonings, but instead making something distinctly yours. The name itself spoke to its potency. Too much and you'd feel the burn, but just enough turned even the plainest meal into something memorable. Today, devil's dust has largely faded into obscurity, overshadowed by commercial spice blends and hot sauces. Yet its spirit lives on in every family recipe that calls for a pinch of this and a shake of that. It was heritage in powder form, a reminder that flavor, like resilience, could always be made from scratch. Sweet potato coffee. Sweet potato coffee is one of those almost forgotten traditions that perfectly captures the ingenuity of African American cooking during hard times. When money was tight and real coffee was either too expensive or unavailable, families turned to what they had on hand. Sweet potatoes, plentiful and cheap, became the unlikely hero. By roasting, grinding, and brewing them, resourceful cooks created a hot, comforting drink that mimicked coffee's richness without ever seeing a single bean. It wasn't just a substitute. For many, it became its own beloved ritual. The process was simple but clever. Sweet potatoes were peeled, sliced thin, and roasted slowly in the oven or over a fire until they darkened and caramelized. Once cooled, the slices were ground into a coarse powder and steeped in hot water, much like traditional coffee grounds. The result was a warm, earthy brew with a natural sweetness and a hint of caramel. Lighter than coffee, but still satisfying enough to sip in the morning or after a long day's work. Some people added milk or molasses to deepen the flavor, while others drank it plain, appreciating its simple charm. Beyond its taste, sweet potato coffee carried meaning. It was resilience in a cup, a reminder that even in scarcity, people found ways to preserve small comforts. Sharing a pot of it at the table wasn't just about the drink itself, it was about togetherness, the ritual of holding something warm, the sense of normalcy it provided when life was anything but normal. Today, sweet potato coffee is rarely seen, though it occasionally resurfaces in heritage food discussions or experimental cafes looking to revive forgotten traditions. Its story endures as a reminder that creativity thrives under pressure and that even in the leanest times, people found ways to sip a little sweetness from the land. And there you have it, 30 dishes that once filled kitchens, carried families through hard times, and created memories that linger even if the food itself has faded. These recipes may be rare today, but their stories remind us of resilience, creativity, and the power of food to bring people together. If this trip down memory lane stirred up your own memories of family meals, I'd love to hear them. Drop a comment with the dish you remember most and maybe share a recipe passed down in your family. And if you enjoyed this journey into forgotten flavors, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep uncovering more stories from the kitchens of the past.